Someone Like You by Sparkypasker, read by Distracted by Books. Chapter 50. Nedzu sat in the waiting room of the hospital, head held in his paws. Aizawa sat next to him, scrolling through reports on his phone. How could I not have seen it? How did I not know what he was planning? Nedzu broke the silence. But is this really that surprising? We knew he was stubborn and didn't trust us. We tried to give him his space and to support his recovery, but we greatly underestimated his lack of self-preservation. His meetings with Hound Dog were unproductive. The only people he seemed to open up to were a handful of his classmates, and we separated him from them when we realized his intelligence was above that of his classmates. We tried to teach him more of what it means to be a hero, but ended up alienating him in the process. It's no wonder he believed he couldn't tell us his thoughts or needs, Aizawa said. But how did he even know? We made sure to keep everything confidential. We never talked about the mission or did any work pertaining to it on campus. Even the students were forbidden from talking about it to their classmates. Nedzu chopped one of his paws into the air in his frustration. Aizawa's eyes widened. Well, I may not know how he found out, but it turns out he was able to access the briefings. He handed his phone over to Nedzu. Nedzu hummed. I'm not sure if I should be angry he disobeyed doctor's orders or impressed he covered his tracks. Since he added his name to the members of the operation, if the HPSC tries to say anything about his presence, he's covered. Since I assisted in researching the Ch50-51 and the chemical analysis of the serum. I'm not sure if he knew about my actual participation or just figured his name being on the list would be enough. But in the end, it doesn't really matter. And I can't see any overt signs of tampering, so it looks like he was added at the time the list was compiled. I suppose that's one less headache to worry about for the time being. When he recovers, we can just talk to him about the ethics of that type of behavior. A small woman in scrubs and green horns stopped at the entrance of the waiting room and looked around. Once she made eye contact with Aizawa, she made a beeline for the two teachers. Are you two the guardians of Midoriya Izuku? She asked. Yes, Aizawa answered. She nodded, grabbing a nearby chair and positioned it in front of them, then sat down. There were a couple other people waiting on the far side of the room, and after determining they were not listening in, she began to speak in a low voice. My name is Dr. Sano. I am his surgeon. How is he? Nedzu asked. He really tried to be patient. The doctor was going to give him all the information eventually, but that was the one thing he needed to know now. Dr. Sano hesitated before answering. Nedzu's heart dropped into his stomach. He was sure he was going to vomit. It's hard to say, she finally answered. Nedzu felt tears start to swell in his lower lids. What had he done? He had brought Midoriya to UA to save him from the Hero Public Safety Commission, to make sure he could continue to help people, to make him a hero, but instead, he may have killed his own student. But don't be mistaken, he's alive. Dr. Sano's words cut through Nedzu's turmoil. Then could you elaborate? Aizawa asked after Nedzu had the chance to pull himself together. The dart in his shoulder was a non-issue overall. It had gotten lodged in between a couple of bones. But there were no nerves affected, so we simply removed it, and that was that. We didn't really realize what was going on until we were able to focus all of our attention on his port. She hunched over, elbows on her knees, and hands clasped tightly together. Frankly, we shouldn't have been focused on his shoulder at all. A little nerve pain was going to be the least of his worries if he died of internal bleeding. But even here, there were some doctors who were unwilling to help him. They would only provide the most minimal of support. They said that performing major surgery on him would have violated their religious beliefs, that everything happened for a reason. All they would do was provide pain relief, which is bullshit. They are just quirkus zealots. If that was what they truly believed, they never would have become surgeons. That's the entire point of surgery to begin with, to defy death. but the administration sided with them. She took a deep breath. To be honest, I'm not supposed to do surgeries by myself. I'm only a resident. I was only able to scrape together a few nurses and a student to help me. We did the best we could. Dr. Sano took a deep breath. Nedzu wanted to shake her, wanted her to keep talking, but more importantly, this hospital was going to have new management soon. At this point, the only thing keeping Nedzu sane was making a plan for taking over a hospital. We were able to remove the dart without causing too much more additional damage, but the port itself was heavily damaged. We were on video call with Recovery Girl during the procedure. She gave me a rundown on Midoriya's medical history and the plan that had been in place before the incident. We agreed he was still not healthy enough to remove it, so we were discussing how to repair it, at least temporarily. We had been able to stop the bleeding, but it wasn't going to be strong enough to hold up to even everyday activities. Could you skip to the important part? Aizawa asked, pinching the bridge of his nose. Nedzu wouldn't be too surprised if Aizawa was planning on how to make certain people disappear. Not that all of it isn't important, but we can read all that later in the report. Well, I was at that part anyway, Dr. Sano sighed. She sat up in her chair, then slouched down into it, mimicking Aizawa. When we were discussing how to repair the port, the skin around it began to cut itself open. What? Aizawa sat up straight, eyes wide. How is that possible? Nedzu's brain began to work overtime. The serum? He mused to himself. Dr. Sano nodded. That is my belief as well. But he doesn't have a quirk, Aizawa stated. According to information provided by the organization that created it, it was specifically designed to attack a person's quirk factor and rewind it into non-existence. So he doesn't have any quirk factors. Shouldn't it just do nothing? That's what Recovery Girl told me as well, but we believe that in the absence of quirk factors, it targeted his temporal factors, Dr. Sano responded. Nedzu perked up. Aren't temporal factors only theoretical? He asked. Previously, yes, but it's the only thing that makes sense. What exactly is a temporal factor? Aizawa asked. It's what controls the flow of time, but the difference for temporal factors is that we believe they exist in every single object, whether it's alive or not. When quirks became more widespread, occasionally you would come across one that affects time. They would send someone to a different time period or make someone older or younger, but these violated everything we knew about linear time. But someone came up with the theory that the quirks were able to work because they didn't affect the universe like what was originally assumed. The quirks were simply too weak to affect that large of an area, which was also why, when someone went back to the past, it had no effect on the future. When their quirk hit their limit, their temporal factors would go back to normal and they would return to their original state, and so would the timeline. For someone whose quirk affected their age, their quirk factors would simply regulate the age of their temporal factor. Because the quirk only affected the temporal factors in the person, it was stronger and, depending on the type of quirk, could be a temporary effect or permanent. Dr. Sano rubbed her temples. In this case, the girl's quirk can only rewind or go to the past. I'm sure you've learned about the accident that occurred when her quirk emerged. I got permission to read the specifics due to it being related to a current patient undergoing changes due to the same quirk. She unknowingly rewound her father, but when the police showed up, there wasn't blood or even a speck of dust. There was nothing to suggest he had been harmed. He was simply gone. If he had been killed, there would have been some sort of evidence. So it's my professional opinion that her quirk's original target is a person's temporal factor. I believe the serum was modified to specifically target a quirk factor, and due to the high dose you experienced and with a lack of quirk factor, the serum simply rewound and unmodified itself. So what does this mean for Midoriya? Aizawa stressed. Hadn't he said to skip to the technical stuff? He's rewinding, Dr. Sano said abruptly. How far? Aizawa clenched his hands inside his pockets. Dr. Sano shook her head. There's no way to tell. As of right now, he has been rewound to before the port was put in. Once we realized what was happening, we had to remove it before his body started to try to rewind around it and keep it stuck in again. We still have him sedated because temporal factors are still largely unknown. We don't know if they record every little thing that has ever happened or not. If that's the case, we will soon come up on when he broke his leg. He doesn't need to go through any more pain than necessary. So he may be rewound out of existence? Nedzu asked. It's possible. We are assuming the girl will eventually learn how to harness her quirk and be able to stop when someone rewinds. Overhaul wouldn't have been able to modify her quirk if that wasn't the case. So if we assume that her control is dependent on the amount of her quirk she controls, then the small amount Midoriya was injected with could eventually use itself up. But there is no way to tell how much of the quirk was used or how far back it will take him. There was screaming and crashing as Shigaraki raged. Toga and Twice had quickly retreated after giving their report of what had happened inside the Ch50-51 compound. What happened to make him that angry? Dabi asked, hands in his pockets and slouched like there was no worries in the world, which, for him, there probably wasn't. His goal was to set the world on fire, so he was probably enjoying the chaos. Oh, Izuku got hit with some of Chisaki's darts. I stuck around for a little bit afterwards, and he got covered in blood. He was so pretty. Toga danced around Dabi excitedly. You stuck around? Kind of risky, don't you think? Dabi asked. Nah, there were a lot of police around, so I disguised myself as one and left as soon as the blood was cleaned up. No point being around someplace so boring, she chirped. Well, as long as you made it back, that's what counts. Yeah, we almost died. No, we didn't, Twice chimed in. Toga laughed. Yeah, it was fun, wasn't it? Yeah. Dabi whistled. He had never heard Twice's sides agree with each other before, but it was no surprise. The two of them were becoming closer and closer as the days went on. They accepted each other for who they were, as did all of the League, but these two took it to a whole different level. They couldn't be found anywhere without each other nowadays. There was a brief pause and the sounds coming from the next room. Maybe he ran out of things to destroy? The League was holed up in a decaying apartment complex. It used to be owned by Magna, but was now empty. The members of the League used to talk a lot about what they did outside of the group and the goals they had for themselves in the future. So they all knew about the children Magna would take in off the street and give a relatively safe home until they could get on their feet. Most people would think that was honorable, but to be honest, Magna didn't really care how the whole getting on their feet thing happened. Sure, she would have preferred if they did things the, quote, right way, but she was a criminal herself. She had killed people. She would have been just as happy if they were able to become successful villains. She just wanted them to have the chance to choose how they want to live their lives. You done? Dabi poked his head into the destroyed living room. They ruined him, Shigaraki mumbled, hunched over and breathing heavily. He was furious. He wanted to just disintegrate everything, but he couldn't. If he did, the League would be found, and they weren't ready yet, and that made him even angrier. It's possible that's not the case. Spinner walked past Dabi and into the room with Shigaraki. laptop in his arms. Are you suggesting we have Sensei give him a quirk? I'm sure he probably has an analysis quirk or two, but there is no guarantee it would be as effective. Shigaraki glared at Spinner. No, not that. Spinner shook his head. Do you remember when we were doing research on the HPSC right after Midoriya was taken? Yeah, and? Shigaraki's fingers twitched. What if the HPSC was wrong? Shigaraki stilled, and his eyes widened. What? We were assuming the same thing as them, that Midoriya had to have a quirk, because we have not seen anyone be that smart without one. But things didn't used to be that way. Back before quirks, there were loads of people who were smart like that. They created cell phones, cars, and hell, even put people into space, all without a quirk. What if being quirkless allowed him to access the intelligence of those people from the past? So he's smart, not because he had a quirk, but because he didn't? Shigaraki asked. Not exactly, but close enough, I suppose. Spinner typed in his computer. But ultimately, I meant that just because he was hit by Chizaki's bullets doesn't mean he is no longer useful. If he was quirkless before he was hit, the bullets wouldn't have done anything, and he would still be the analyst we all know and love. Shigaraki began to cackle. Hands curled into claws. He's still here. He's still with us, he screamed. The trill of a cell phone cut off Shigaraki's scream abruptly. He stood up semi-straight, reached into his pocket, and pulled out his phone. What? He grumbled. Ah, Shigaraki, glad I was able to reach you. Shigaraki's eye began to twitch. Jiran was someone who had just recently contacted them, claiming to be able to find quality recruits. Shigaraki had believed hiring him was redundant as they already had the analyst, but once the HPSC got their hands on him, the League had been forced to hire Jiran as a temporary replacement. What do you want? Shigaraki barked into the phone. Jiran's laugh could be heard by the others in the apartment. I have a lead on an organization I think you would be able to collaborate with. They have a similar goal. They want everyone to be able to use their quirks how they want. Their goal is a world with personal freedom. I don't know. They seem kind of lame. Besides, I'm looking for more knights. I don't need another kingdom coming in to claim my dungeon. Don't think of it like that. The rest of the League could hear the smile in his voice. Whenever a kingdom goes to war, they're always looking for their allies to help them out. Dabi raised his eyebrow incredulously. Usually the only person who is able to translate Shigaraki's analogies is Spinner. Who knew Jiran was a gamer? Maybe. Hey, that's good enough for me. I will go get a meeting with their leader and let you know how it goes. It's located in Daika City, though, so it's quite a trek. Yeah, safe travels. Shigaraki hung up. He wasn't interested in hearing anything else. He would get the rundown after Jiran's interview anyway. Chapter 51. Izuku sat in his bed at Heights Alliance. He had been told what was going on by Dr. Sano, and he would still need to go in for appointments occasionally, but there was nothing they could do to counter Aries' quirk. They said his leg had rebroken while he was unconscious, so they now knew he was going to re-experience any injuries he had had. They wanted to keep him sedated until he stopped de-aging, but Izuku had told them it was unnecessary. It wasn't like he had experienced many serious injuries in the past few years. Nothing he couldn't deal with anyway. So, he had been discharged and was currently, quote, resting back at the dorms. But it was really like house arrest. When he got back, he had really gotten an earful from Nedzu and Eraserhead. But he wasn't really sure why. Things would have turned out a lot worse if he wasn't there. There was a knock on his door. Midoriya? It was Uraraka. If you're feeling up to it, do you want to come hang out with us in the common room? Izuku thought for a second. He wasn't really sure he wanted to be around others, but after being locked on campus without access to his phone or computer, he was getting restless. He walked to his door and opened it. Uraraka looked a little startled, not expecting him to respond, considering how he had ignored them since he had joined their class. Sure, Izuku said softly, stepping out into the hallway and closing the door. Once Uraraka processed his response, she smiled brightly and led the way to the first floor. When Izuku stepped into the room, everyone tried to keep doing what they had been doing, but Izuku could tell they were struggling to stay focused. They didn't want a repeat of when he was released from the HPSC, but the smiles they all had gave away how they really felt. Midoriya! He heard from across the room. Izuku turned that direction and saw Kirishima sitting on a couch, tapping the back in a motion Izuku recognized as Kirishima requesting Izuku come sit next to him. Izuku hesitated. Bakugo was sitting in the same area, but he wasn't scared of him anymore. He hadn't been for a long time, so why the hesitation? He just didn't want to deal with him. He was feeling some mild apprehension that Bakugo would start something, and undoubtedly Izuku would have to finish it. Bakugo noticed Izuku staring. He stood from his seat and walked into the kitchen, mumbling something about grabbing a snack. Izuku watched him walk away, and when he didn't immediately come back out, Izuku walked over to Kirishima and sat next to him on the couch. Uraraka followed and sat in the spot Bakugo previously occupied. You're looking better, Uraraka said cheerfully. Yeah, you're still kind of skinny, but you're not as pale, Kirishima added. One of his hands was lifted in the air. To Izuku, it looked like Kirishima was wanting to maybe play with his hair or pat him on the head. He wasn't sure why, though. Izuku looked Kirishima in the eye and nodded slightly, curious. It's not like Kirishima was going to hurt him or anything. He may not have known him really well, but he knew Kirishima enough to know that he knew Kirishima well enough to know that wasn't what his personality was like. It's not like he was Bakugo. So fluffy, he heard Kirishima mumble under his breath. I didn't know the hospital had someone like Recovery Girl. You are healed up extremely well for what you went through in the short amount of time you were there. Ida walked over to the three of them and took a seat in a chair that was positioned opposite of Uraraka. Oh, they don't, Izuku responded absent-mindedly, watching Kirishima gently pull out a curl, then let it go and watch it spring back. Then how did you get healed up so well? A boy with bright blonde hair, Kaminari Denki, asked, leaning against the couch behind Kirishima's head, watching Kirishima play with Izuku's hair. You don't have to tell us, though. Ojiro walked over and gave Kaminari his tail. Ojiro had seen Kaminari's hands twitch and knew playing with hair was something he liked to do to keep himself calm. Otherwise, he might get a little too rambunctious and scare the green-haired boy away. I don't mind. It was Aries' quirk. I got hit by a few of Overhaul's bullets. That really scared me, Kirishima said softly. I saw you collapse and I was so scared. I didn't know you were going to be there. I felt like I failed you. If I had known you were there, I could have backed you up. Tears gathered in his eyes. Why? Because I'm quirkless? Izuku asked. Course not, you nerd. Izuku heard Bakugo grumble from behind him. Izuku looked over the back of the couch. Bakugo was sitting at a table munching on a bowl of popcorn. I know you haven't been around these extras for long, but none of them think any less of you for being quirkless. You surprised the hell out of me, too, by showing up there unannounced. But it was definitely a lot easier bringing down that nutcase with you there. Izuku was stunned. Had Bakugo said anything nice about him before? Ever? Even before his quirk emerged and Izuku's hadn't? Oh, sorry. Izuku apologized. It's understandable, Todoroki said from his spot standing next. It's understandable, Todoroki said from his spot standing behind Ida. When you get the same reaction from people throughout your entire life, what they say is what you tend to believe. Izuku supposed Todoroki actually knew what he was talking about when it came from that. The two of them couldn't be more different, but Izuku supposed being compared to Endeavor your entire life can have similar consequences of being called quirkless all your life. Because considering how powerful Endeavor is, if you can't meet the expectations placed upon you by the relationship, you may as well be quirkless. So you're better now, right? Sue came and sat on the arm of Uraraka's couch. Izuku hummed to himself. He wasn't sure if he wanted to tell them the specifics, and he was sure that if he didn't, they would understand. Ojiro did say he didn't have to say anything, but was there going to be any harm in telling them? It's not like he was going to be able to hide it. They were going to notice something was different when he got younger. Not exactly, he said hesitantly. What do you mean? Kirishima stopped playing with Izuku's hair and grabbed his hand. Well, it turns out if you overdose on Overhaul's serum and don't have a quirk, it just rewinds you instead, Izuku confessed. Kirishima looked worried. How far are you going to get rewound? You don't look much different than you did at the mall. They don't know. Maybe into nothing, he said quietly. The soft sounds that had been in the background suddenly stopped. None of Class 1A moved or breathed. Izuku looked at Kirishima from the corner of his eyes. Tears were silently streaming down his cheeks. A squeak of a chair accompanied Bakugo abruptly standing from the table. He threw his bowl into the sink and silently trudged up the stairs. Izuku couldn't quite see his face. Bakugo's hair shadowed his eyes. He never smiled unless he was attempting to murder someone, so his eyes were how Izuku had learned to read his emotions. They can't do anything. Yaoyorozu quietly walked up to the small group gathered around the coffee table. Izuku shrugged. Not really. To do any additional testing to find a way to block the effects, they would either have to use up the remaining bullets that are in evidence with the police and possibly lose the case and allow a villain to go free, or to further traumatize a child. So they're not going to do anything? Uraraka said in frustration. As class representative, I believe that to be unacceptable. I must speak with Principal Nedzu immediately, Ida said with a chop of his hand. His face looked serious as he stood from his chair and walked towards the door to the dorms. I'll go with him. Make sure he doesn't get too... Yaoyorozu waved her hand around in the air. The others in the class must have understood what she meant because they simply nodded their heads. I'll go talk with Aizawa, Shinso added. Some of the other students jumped in their seats, not realizing he was there. Izuku raised his eyebrows at how Shinso addressed Eraserhead so casually, but to be honest, Shinso reminded Izuku of the black-clad hero quite a lot. It would be no surprise if Shinso was taken under the hero's wing, which, now that Izuku thought about it, was probably a bad analogy considering there were heroes out there with actual wings. Without waiting for anyone to respond, Shinso walked out the door behind Ida and Yaoyorozu. One by one, the remainder of the classmates began to dissipate. Uraraka left with a soft, I need to be alone for a while, which was promptly ignored by the remaining feminine classmates. Aoyama stopped by the refrigerator for a handful of different cheeses before following them. Izuku halfway remembers something about making women happy with cheese. It was during one of his 3 a.m. deep dives. He had gotten on to what he thought was a villain chat room, but turned out to be not that. Was the cheese thing really actually a thing? Kirishima continued to sit with Izuku on the couch. When the two of them were alone, Kirishima pulled gently on Izuku's hand to get his attention. Izuku looked at Kirishima. The tear tracks on his cheeks were trying to dry, but were losing the battle. Hey, can I tell you something? Kirishima asked. Izuku cocked his head to the side slightly. Sure, he said in response. I'm scared. Kirishima squeezed Izuku's hand. What are you scared of? Izuku asked, squeezing his hand back. Of losing you? Oh. Izuku just remembered. Class 1A lost a classmate during the League of Villains attack on the USJ. He could understand if there was fear in losing another classmate within just a few months. I'm sorry for the loss of your classmate at USJ, Izuku said. I never did give my condolences to you or any of your classmates. I should have done that when I met you at the mall. I'm sorry. This must be bringing back painful memories. No, well, yes, that too, but actually, Kirishima hesitated, you just joined us. I haven't gotten the opportunity to get to know you yet. When I was in middle school, there was a situation with a couple of girls from my school who were being harassed by this guy that was much bigger than us. I was too scared to help them, and Ashido, we went to the same middle school, ended up helping them instead. Since then, I told myself I would not hesitate to do what I wanted to do anymore. And what I want to do is get to know you, to be there for you when you need someone. Like now? Came out of Izuku's mouth before his brain was able to process what he was actually feeling. Oh, he shouldn't have said that. His face went bright red. That was stupid. Just because Kirishima said he wanted to get to know him didn't mean he wanted to do it now. He could have meant during class, little doses at a time. Kirishima certainly didn't want Izuku dumping his life story into his lap. Yes, like now. Kirishima gave Izuku a small smile. Izuku's eyes widened. Well, there's not really much any of us can do, Izuku said. That's okay. As long as you know that you can talk to me if you want to, and I will listen, no matter when. Izuku nodded and just continued to look at the floor while waiting for the redness in his cheeks to go away. Hey! Kirishima said happily while wiping away the wetness that had gathered on his eyes. How about we do that brainstorming session now? For the festival? All I have been able to think of is a weightlifting competition. Kirishima stood up from the couch, Izuku's hand still held loosely in his, as if he was giving Izuku the chance to either grab it so Kirishima could help him up off the furniture, or let go. Izuku shifted his hand within Kirishima's to get a firmer grip. Sounds good. Like you said, it's a date. End of chapters.